Okay, this is part one of the VCA digital resource developed to assist nature conservation students to complete their will in VCA assignments. During this presentation, you'll be guided through the following data collection steps. What data do you have to collect? What equipment is required? How you go about identifying a particular plant community or homogeneous plant community. This is very important. What method of data collection must be used, and what are the steps needed to ensure that the data which is collected is correct. And then what we will do at the end is we'll recap everything and wrap up the data collection aspect of a VCA assignment. Let's start with data you need to collect. The minimum amount per transect is 200 data points, and one piece of data is linked to a species name if you hit it, or you missed it, or bare ground. I'll explain this again later as we go by. A minimum of 3 transects per plant community is required. Remember that data needs to be confirmed, and one plant community or one transect within one plant community is not enough to confidently say that all the plant communities that look the same carry the same species composition. And there is also associated information. For example, the GPS point, the center of your plant community, the height above sea level, the date you collected, which is important, who collected it, and the method that was used. Let's have a look at the equipment that is needed. If you look over here, there's the stick at the back. Over here, that's for pointing. The data capture sheets here, you can see all the basic information there, pen, very important, a grass book, cell phone, and optional things is a GPS. So let's just recap. Clipboard, data sheet, pointing stick, pen, mobile phone, and GPS, which is optional. Batteries for your GPS, a grass book, just to help you in the field, an exercise book, and rubber bands. The exercise book there is a makeshift plant press. For those plants that you can't identify in the field, you take samples and you identify it later, because if you had to identify all the plants that you don't know while doing your veld condition assessment, you're going to be there all day and you're only going to cover one transect. So best have that exercise book with you so that you can press and give it a name, and then use that name in your data sheet, which you can replace once you've identified it properly. And because you're going to be out in the bush all day, personal protective equipment, things like hats, water, sunscreen, boots, long pants, and a day pack with food and snacks, things like that. You can use first aid kit if you stand on thorns or something like that. So before we start even collecting the data, we need to be able to identify a plant community. This you do by sight generally, and you back that up by data that you've collected. So when you're standing looking at your community out in the bush or from a satellite image, you look for uniform color, and in the bush it would be height as well. You would look for the majority of the same species. If you look at this photograph here, you can see it is homogeneous. It's all part. You can see that there's a few of these Erogrostis gumiflora here, but there's also other species in there in between. But generally, this plant community is homogeneous, looks the same. And that one would be a good one for doing the VCA. Getting back to plant communities. When you're doing your plant community, you cannot start collecting data if there's ecotones within your plant community, or any human-induced disturbances like roads, sand mines or dump site or buildings, old cars lying in the bush and things like that. It all impacts on the community that you're looking at. You might have heard me use the word ecotone. Here's a simple example of an ecotone, or a couple of them. In the front, in the foreground, we've got the grass community. You can see it looks all similar heights, basic, similar plant species. And then all of a sudden, we have a sharp ecotone here, because all of a sudden we have these protea species appear. Okay, so we've got a protea tree community here with underlying grass species in there. And then we have a gradual ecotone up here, going higher up onto the slope. It is other bush veld species that are appearing. There are still one or two protea species there. That's what makes it gradual. But it definitely is a different plant community. The one down here at the base of the hill is very different from on top of the hill and approaching the hill. And those are three plant communities. And then for this assignment and for your experience here, it's simple just to focus on a plant community that is very similar. And we expect you only to understand how to do a VCA using the plant community, the grass plant community. If we look at the same thing from above, from a satellite image or from an aeroplane, you can see what I mean by color differences. We've got these dark patches and light grey patches, and we've got dots which represent trees. You can see here lots of trees, right? And here a little bit of green and so on. You can't do, here's a roads, as you can see, in fire breaks or old fire break scars, which we cannot use or have those included in our transects. If we're going across like that, it's obviously going to be very different. Okay, so let's have a look. When we do it, we outline plant community number one, and you can see they're all different. There's not one continuous plant community. They mosaic, they patchwork, right? And there's many different reasons for this. Mainly underground, the soil types, water availability, things like that. Then we're doing plant community 2, and if you look at this one, it surrounds some of plant community 1. Okay, so in these areas where it crosses here, this would be a gentle ecotone between one grass species into another grass species. Okay, but that's not the same for all around plant community number 1. All right. And then if we look at plant community number 3, it doesn't come across or cross over between any of the plant communities. It's very distinct. You can see here all the trees over there and all the trees over there. And these boundaries between plant community 2 and plant community 3 is a very hard one, or very sharp one. When we're doing transects and collecting felt condition data, we need to make sure that we collect sufficient data in the plant communities to be certain that we are dealing with the same community. And the more data we collect, the more rigorous, more robust that data is. Okay, you can't dispute that data. So you can see the little crosses here. In this plant community 1 representation over here, we've got 3 transects that we're doing over here. And then to make sure that this plant community is the same as that one, we've done transect there, there, and all the others there, making it 13 in total. Alright, so that's how we make sure that our plant communities are, that we can identify the plant community correctly, and the data that we're collecting is to make sure that those plant communities are correct, and that the data that we collect in those plant communities is sufficient. Now, for assignment purposes, we're only going to ask you to do 1. But remember, that when you're a manager of a reserve, one little data set is not enough to manage this entire area. Okay, because you can already see there's a whole lot of plant communities and they all have their own special needs. Okay, so you need to make sure that you collect enough data. Now, to collect the data you need to use a particular method that is repeatable. What do I mean by that is that next year you're going to do it again, and the year after that you're going to do it again. So you have to have a method that you can repeat year after year with very little difference between year after year, so that you're collecting the same type of data. That means you can compare the data from year 1 to year 2 and so on. Okay. For this VCA assignment, we want you to use the step point method of collecting your data. Because our plant communities sometimes are small and they're not continuous, as you saw in the image from the satellite image, they were little circles. And if you did a 200-meter transect, there's a good chance that your transect would run out of your plant community into another one. So you identify your plant community using those basic characteristics: height, uniform color, majority of species. Okay. You record this plant community using a GPS or a cell phone, and you try to find the middle of that community where you're going to do your VCA. It's always a good idea to take photographs, and I'll explain how you take those photographs. But again, over the years your plant community might change. It might be a little, it might be a lot. And these photographs that you've taken over the years, become more and more valuable when they're linked to the data that you've collected. The way we'd like to suggest to stay within your plant community is to use a cross. So you orientate yourself, you found the central point in your plant community, and you orientate yourself so that you know where north is, south, east and west is. Okay, you can use your cell phone, GPS, or if you're lucky you've been there before, you know where the sun comes up and where it sets, so you know where west and east is. And then for your step point, you're taking 50 data points or 50 steps in each of those 4 directions, which will then total 200 points in that one data set. You'd have to repeat this in 2 other locations within that same plant community to make sure that your data is accurate and representative of that plant community. I know you've been taught to use to mark the front of your shoe, or to use a stick. I prefer to use a stick just because when you're walking through thick bush, your shoe, the point of your shoe is not always visible. So there's a lot of sticks lying around, easy enough to get one, and use your stick to point your data. So step 1, habitat selection. I said you found it, you found your center point, and you take a GPS reading. You orientate yourself in the 4 directions, north, and you take a photograph in the northerly direction, and you take your 50 data points. Okay. You come back to the center point, and you do your south, and you repeat that. Another photograph, another 50 data points, and you do east, another photograph, 50 data points, west, photograph, data points. So looking at this, you've got 4 basic photographs, you've got 200 data points, you know where the center point of your plant community is, and you've got all the data you need for this assignment. But remember, as a manager, you would have to use that GPS point again next year at roughly the same time. So if you do your VCA in late summer, when the inflorescence of your grass species is still good, then every March wherever you, end of February, whatever, you would do your GPS, go to your GPS points and go and collect the data again. Let's have a look at what a good photograph would look like. In the past, the photographs that I have got are not always very representative, because we got a lot of blue sky, a lot of background, and very little representation of the actual grass community that we surveyed. So here we suggest that you put 1/3 of your photograph where the horizon is, and 2/3 in the foreground is your community that you're doing. Okay, so this is your community that you're doing. By putting 1/3 in your horizon, there's always something in the horizon. These poles here, when I'm looking north, come back a year later, I've got my photograph, and I can see there's the pole, and I can make a similar photograph again. And we can have a look what the photograph can compare year on year. So that's a good photograph, good representation of what a plant community photograph would look like. What are the steps needed to ensure that you've collected the data correctly? Recapping here again, you've made sure that you've identified the homogeneous plant community, that you take good clear photographs from the central point, so that you can always get the photographs from the same point, and you're using a pointing stick to indicate the 200 data points. There's always other information, as I've mentioned before, the date, okay, so that you can repeat it year after year using similar time of the season. Collectors, it's always good to use the same collector, because he or she would use the same method, same step size year on year. The elevation, that helps with the background data, and your GPS point, that center point that we talk about.
Start with step 1.
Alright, so there you can see how it was done, demonstrating it there, and just some other information which I haven't yet mentioned, and that is the hit and miss. We'll do that now. So step 1, you're going to do this data capture, and here it is. So step by step that I was doing, we were recording it, okay, and you can see there the first step I did was Erogrostis limidensis. Second step I did was Hyperenia hirta. So the third step was Erogrostis chloromelis, and look here, I indicated that it was hit. But before we go any further there, some basic data. You can see here the student name, Wilson, the date was 1st of February this year. The central point was that GPS location, so we can always go back there, and the elevation was 1400 meters above sea level. We could have added the weather condition. As you can see from the video footage, it was overcast and windy. That doesn't really impact on the data collection, other than it's not so nice collecting that time. Let's have a look at a miss. Take a look there, you can see the stick point is not hitting any of the grass swords that are coming out from the ground, but there's some grass around. Okay, and there you can see all the species that we collected out of those 200 data points that we did that were misses. Okay, but they were the closest plant species to the point of the stick, and we recorded that. Okay, the next one was the hits. Look at that. If you look carefully, you can see the stick point is piercing the grass as it's coming out from the ground, erupting from the ground. That's a hit. Okay? These hits and misses, as you can see there, we've got 7 of them, is important to capture this data while you're in the field, because this is what you would need to use to calculate density. Okay? Without doing that, you're missing some of your data, and you can't go back and collect the data after you've gone through it. What we didn't come across when we collected this data in the field was bare ground. Now when we do bare ground, you can notice the point of the stick goes in there and there's no grass species or no species whatsoever living within a 25 centimeter radius from any direction of this stick. We have to record bare ground here because it impacts or influences our calculations at the end. So that is an important aspect to remember. So let us recap. Select your pond community, capture your basic site information, elevation, date, collector, GPS point, and your photographs. Get your directions right so that it's random, that you're not being influenced by certain factors in the plant community. You collect your 200 data points, and then you must make sure that you collect the data from more than 3 or 2 other sites besides the one you're doing now. And at this point, once you've done all of that and you've got all your data, you are ready to go home and start working on the calculations and interpretation. But again, let me warn you or to bring to your attention that you've collected data from one site for your assignments. As a manager, you need to do this over and over and over again, and it must be repeatable and comparable over years. When it's comparable over the years, the data becomes a lot more valuable as you can see trends in the plant community. Whereas what you've got now after collecting 200 data points is a snapshot. You don't know what happened the day before or the day after the day you did your collection. But over multiple years of data collection, you can say what happened to the plant community over those years. So just bear that in mind when you're doing your interpretation. Plus, when you're doing stocking rates and grazing capacity, this data is important to have over numerous years. Again, because the more data you have, the more rigorous it is, the more robust it is, the better it is for you to make decisions as a manager. Thank you and enjoy your NCA assignment on VCAs.